Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we aren't strolling through moonlit ruins or whispering secrets about emperors. No, you're stepping with me into the harsh, sun-baked dust of the Roman slave market, the Forum Piscarium perhaps, or maybe a grittier provincial equivalent, where human lives are measured in the clinking weight of silver and gold. Look around you. The air here is thick, a swirling mix of sweat, unwashed wool, stale wine from the taverns nearby, and the dry, metallic tang of fear. You can almost feel the heat radiating off the cobblestones, shimmering above the rows of people who stand silent, waiting, their feet suspended between the whim of a bidder and the chalk mark on their foot. Imagine yourself as a wealthy paterfamilias, the head of a Roman household, dressed in a pristine white toga, perhaps a touch too wide for the heat, standing here to make an investment. You aren't buying cattle, you are buying a human being, a potential cook, a tutor for your children, a personal valet, or maybe just a disposable body for the treacherous work in your Spanish silver mine. The sheer scale of this trade is what ought to stun you first. Slavery wasn't a fringe institution in Rome. It was the engine, the foundational chassis upon which the entire Republic and later the Empire was built. Historians still argue whether at the height of the Empire, slaves constituted a third of the population in Italy, but what's undeniable is that you couldn't eat, wash, travel, or even get dressed without the silent, ubiquitous labour of the enslaved. To walk through Rome and not see a slave was to walk through a city that simply didn't exist. It was everywhere. It was essential. And here's your cheeky reality check. In the 1st century CE, if you were a citizen, even a minor one, living in Italy, the chances were astronomically high that you owned, were owned by, or were perpetually surrounded by a system that considered you, or someone you knew, entirely disposable. You probably won't survive this world, not as a free person anyway, without somehow encountering the chilling logic of human commodification. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell us where you're listening from tonight. Post your location in local time down in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far we stretch into the quiet corners of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand by the rostrum, the elevated platform where the auctioneer, a man with a booming theatrical voice, is currently extolling the virtues of a young, strapping Gaul. The auctioneer is pointing out the man's strong back, his clean bill of health, attested to by a small scroll of parchment, and his general lack of visible scars or behavioural issues. The man himself, stripped to the waist, looks numbly ahead, his spirit already miles away. This scene, this open transactional display of a human as mere chattel mancipium, is a mainstream historical fact that defines the Roman economy. Slaves are property, legally speaking, tools with voices, instrumentum vocale, as one Roman writer so delicately put it. The state protected your ownership of them with the same rigour it protected your ownership of a mule or a piece of land. The variety of merchandise on display is staggering. Over here, you see a group of pale, red-haired women from Britannia. Over there, a few dark-skinned men from Africa, perhaps Nubian or Libyan, prized for their stamina. Tucked away on a side bench is a tiny, elderly Greek man, his face etched with scholarly lines, who is probably worth more than the entire group of Gauls combined, simply because he can read, write, and manage complex accounts. And this is where the market's chilling mathematics begins, in the valuation of a human being. A good, basic, unskilled male slave, a worker for a farm or a workshop, was roughly equivalent to the price of a small house in the countryside, or a decent vineyard. We're talking about prices that could range from 1,000 to 5,000 sestertii for a standard healthy adult field hand in the early empire. To give you some context, a Roman soldier earned about 900 sestertii a year around the time of Augustus. So, a basic slave could cost several years of a legionary's pay. But here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes, if a slave was known to be a runaway risk, or had a chronic but non-fatal medical condition, he would be sold wearing a small cap or a hat, known as the pileus. This wasn't some fashionable accessory. It was a silent, visual warning to the buyer, signalling that the seller was explicitly making no warranties about the merchandise, a kind of caveat emptor, or buyer beware tag. It's a strangely polite custom and a brutally impolite transaction, ensuring that a buyer couldn't later sue for fraud. A hat, a simple piece of cloth, meant all the difference between a guaranteed purchase and a massive gamble on a human life. The system was lubricated by the constant, aggressive expansion of the Roman state. You see, the primary source for the slave market wasn't breeding them within the estates. Though that happened, it was the relentless machine of military conquest. When a Roman legion defeated an enemy tribe, say in Germania or Dacia, the surviving captives were bundled together, marched in chains, and shipped to the nearest market. The successful war meant a sudden glut in the supply, and as basic economics dictates, a glut in supply meant a drop in price. This created a strange paradox. The military success that enriched Rome also devalued the human labour it captured. At times, after a massive victory, prices could plummet so low that a healthy captive might be had for the cost of a few bottles of decent wine. Historians still argue whether the number of slaves sold following major wars, like Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, periodically collapsed the value of the average field hand for decades, making it cheaper to simply buy a replacement than to treat an injured one. And now, a bit of light relief. Imagine the headache of a Roman tax collector trying to keep track of all this. The state had various ways of taxing the transfer of property, and slaves were no exception. You had to pay a tax on the sale, usually 4% of the price, vicissima libertatis. But imagine the arguments. Is my cook worth this much? I tell you guys, his sauces are merely acceptable. I should not pay the full tax on a slave whose skills are so mediocre. Every Roman complained about taxes, even when buying another human being. It's a wonderfully petty human trait that cuts across millennia. The buyer's scrutiny is intense. You watch as a prospective buyer prods the Gaul's muscles, checking the tautness of the skin, the clearness of his eyes, and even inspecting his teeth like you would a horse. The auctioneer ensures the buyer knows that this particular slave has had his origins fully disclosed. In Roman law, a seller was obligated to disclose any defects, a tendency to run away, a propensity for theft, or serious illness. Failed to do so, and you could face a lawsuit for actio redhibitoria, forcing you to take the slave back and return the money. It was a consumer protection law for the buyers of humans, which is a truly bleak piece of legal history. The crowd shifts, a small ripple of murmurs passing through the buyers as the bidding begins to slow. The final, sharp clang of the auctioneer's hammer seals the deal. The Gaul now belongs to a stern-faced man who probably needs him to work his olive press down in Campania. He is taking away a number chalked on his thigh already smeared by the dust. The sheer volume of human bodies flowing into the market, day after day, year after year, fundamentally shaped Rome's culture of work, leisure and violence. It ensured that physical labour, outside of military service, was generally seen as demeaning the work of the enslaved. To be truly Roman, truly free, was to manage, to command, to govern, and to leave the dirty, backbreaking or even tedious intellectual work to your human property. The next offering is a small family unit, a mother and 2 children, a more complex emotional and financial transaction. The auctioneer emphasises their loyalty, their ability to work as a cohesive domestic unit, and the potential value of the children as they grow. Selling families together was generally preferred, as it often ensured better behaviour and loyalty from the adults, which translated to a higher final price. Yet, the law did not strictly require it, and the agonising separation of families was a constant, heartbreaking feature of this entire institution, especially in cases of debt slavery or wills. You feel the weight of this exchange, the cold, hard reality that every citizen here, every senator, every baker, every prostitute, every soldier, and every philosopher had a price attached to their person, or was involved in setting the price of another. The Roman world was a machine, and the fuel was the uncompensated labour of millions of people who, just moments ago, were considered free in their own homes, speaking their own languages and living their own lives. The sun begins to climb higher, turning the dust motes into shimmering gold, but the shadow this market casts over the entire society is impossible to ignore. It is in this relentless cycle of conquest, sale and labour that the price of Rome's grandeur was paid, one human transaction at a time. The next time the hammer falls, you'll start to understand the very source of this unrelenting, chilling supply. The stench of the market still clings to you, that mix of fear and sweat. But now, let's leave the auctioneer's block for a moment and journey to the source of the supply. Where do all these people come from, you ask? The answer is as simple as it is terrifying. They come from the constant, grinding and ruthlessly efficient Roman war machine. You are now standing not in Rome, but somewhere on the edge of the known world, perhaps following the marching legions as they press into Dacia or Germania. Look at the column snaking its way back towards civilization. It is not just heavy with captured bronze, gold, or exotic furs. It is heavy with human bodies, marching in chains. This is the human cost of conquest, and it is, historically speaking, the single greatest, most volatile factor driving the Roman slave economy. Think of the economic impact of a general like Pompey the Great returning from his campaigns in the East. Mainstream historical fact tells us that Pompey's victory over Mithridates VI and subsequent organization of the Near East in the 60s BCE flooded the markets with so many captives that the price of an average slave plummeted across Italy. It was a massive involuntary transfer of human capital from the defeated to the victors. The very act of extending the empire's borders was in essence a giant state-sponsored slave raid. You can practically feel the fatigue radiating off the prisoners. They are Gauls, Britons, Thracians, and Greeks, all walking under the unforgiving sun, their national identities stripped away, replaced by the crushing reality of their new status: captives. Their value is already being assessed by the quartermasters. Are they strong enough for the mines? Are they educated enough for the villa? Are they young enough to be easily trained? This constant influx created a peculiar boom and bust cycle for prices. When the Roman legions were victorious and brought back tens of thousands of captives, sometimes 50,000 or more from a major engagement, the markets were glutted. This was a fire sale on humanity. If you were a Roman landholder with cash on hand, this was the time to buy cheap, durable labour for your sprawling latifundia large estates. There's like a sudden, massive stock dividend paid out to the conquerors. A wealthy buyer might secure a dozen strong men for the price of a single, highly specialised household slave during a period of scarcity. Now, imagine the logistical nightmare. The general can't simply march 30,000 prisoners directly to the Roman Forum and start shouting prices. A vast specialised infrastructure was needed. We're talking about professional slave dealers known as mangones or negotiatores who would follow the armies. They'd buy the captives wholesale right there on the frontier for a fixed low price, a bulk discount on human beings, and then handle the grueling high-risk process of marching, feeding, and shipping them back to the major distribution hubs like Delos in the east or Puteoli in Italy. These dealers were essentially the venture capitalists of the slave trade, absorbing the risk of captives dying of disease, starvation, or mutiny on the long journey, in exchange for the potential for massive profits when they finally reached the higher-priced Italian markets. You're watching one now, a Mango in a rough leather tunic, haggling fiercely with a legionary legate over a pen of captured Sarmatians. He's complaining about the cost of ropes and the terrible quality of the biscuits he'll have to feed them on the road. It's an oddly pedestrian conversation about maximising profit, even though the inventory is human life. Here's a light joke for you. The Mango would always complain to the general, "These Thracians look strong, but they don't even know how to properly tile a roof. I'm going to have to pay another dealer to teach them skills. I'm practically losing money on this batch," as if teaching someone a skill was the real hardship, not the lifelong bondage. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the less common, yet historically attested, forms of acquisition was the Roman tradition of selling one's own children into slavery, or more accurately, into a form of temporary bondage to pay off crushing debts. This practice, known as nexium in the early Republic, eventually became legally restricted and then outright forbidden, especially as the concept of citizenship expanded. However, a loophole persisted, particularly in times of severe famine or economic crisis. The father, the paterfamilias, had such absolute legal power over his family, the patria potestas, that he could, in essence, sell his children across the Tiber. Then, outside Roman territory, from which they could be bought back, circumventing some laws against selling them within Rome. It's a chilling testament to the lengths of Roman poverty and the totalizing power of the family head. The value of these war captives, once they hit the Roman market, depended heavily on the demand curve of the moment. If a war had been fought in a region known for producing specific skills, that supply would temporarily drive down the price for those specific skills. For example, if a campaign in Greece brought back philosophers, doctors and sculptors, suddenly the price for an educated slave might dip slightly, allowing a lower-tier Roman to afford a tutor for his children, where before only the elite could. Conversely, a period of sustained peace was a disaster for the slave-buying class. Without fresh captures, the prices of basic strong labourers would inexorably climb. This scarcity forced Romans to rely more heavily on vernae, slaves born into the household, and to invest more in the health and longevity of their existing stock. In a way, peace created a temporary cynical rise in the value and arguably the minimal care given to the enslaved. Historians still argue whether the desire for cheap human labour was a primary cause for Roman expansion, or merely a highly profitable byproduct of a naturally aggressive martial culture. Did generals choose targets based on the presumed value of the human harvest, or did the massive intake of slaves simply become an economic necessity once the system was established? It's a fascinating chicken and egg debate that lies at the heart of Roman imperialism. The distinction between different sources of supply was crucial. War captives, the bulk commodity, often fetched lower, more volatile prices. They were cheaper, but they also carried greater risks. They were more likely to revolt, harbour resentment, or simply not understand the language or culture. Contrast this with the venae, the homeborn slaves. They were often more expensive at auction, not because they were necessarily stronger, but because they were socialised. They knew the routines of a Roman household, spoke Latin, and were perceived as more loyal and less likely to run away. You were buying a familiar, domesticated tool, rather than a wild, recently captured one. Imagine a Roman buyer examining a captive Briton, fresh off the boat. The auctioneer stresses his brute strength for construction work, but the buyer is wary. The Briton's eyes flash defiance. He's clearly not broken yet. Now imagine the same buyer examining a young Vatic housebound slave. The boy's polite, speaks a little Greek, and bows correctly. The Vatic will cost significantly more, perhaps double the price of the Briton, because the buyer isn't just paying for labour, he's paying for integration and peace of mind. It's a nasty piece of calculation, but one that every wealthy Roman performed. Risk versus reward in human property. You might buy 5 cheap, high-risk captives, knowing 3 might die or run, or you could buy 1 expensive, low-risk Venus and rely on him for decades. This brings us to a slightly darker joke. A Roman buyer is haggling over a group of freshly captured Germans. The Mango sighs, "Honesty, Gaius, these are fine, strong men, but they insist on wearing pants. Can you imagine a scandal? I've had to buy a bulk order of tunics just to make them look presentable for the market. That's a huge hidden cost." The buyer shakes his head. "Tough luck, but I'm deducting the cost of 5 years of beard oil from your price." They look far too dignified. The war machine's contribution to the market wasn't just about quantity. It was also about status. Owning a slave from a recently defeated, culturally significant enemy, like a talented Syrian architect or a well-known philosopher from Athens, was a status symbol that transcended mere economic value. It showed not just wealth, but that you were actively participating in the spoils of Roman domination. Your slave's origin was a testament to your nation's power. The market, then, is not just a place of commerce. It is the ultimate scoreboard of Rome's military success. Every face, every chained ankle represents a successful battle, a conquered city, and a territory added to the empire. When you walk away from the sight of the marching captives, you realize the price Romans paid for slaves was perpetually defined by one factor: the continuous, bloody, and relentless efficiency of its legions. We'd established that the Roman war machine was the roaring engine of the slave trade, relentlessly driving thousands of captives into the markets. But what happens when the legions are temporarily resting, or when peace breaks out on a key frontier? Demand, especially in the massive households of the elite, remains constant, and prices climb. When the main highway of supply closes, you find yourself turning down the grimy, winding alleyways of secondary sources, piracy, debt, and the trade in abandoned infants. You're standing now not in the organised camp of a legion, but perhaps along the rugged coastline of Cilicia, an area historically notorious for its pirate nests. Before Pompey swept the sea clean. It may look placid, but it hides a terrifying industry. The Ricey wasn't just about stealing cargo. It was fundamentally about kidnapping for profit. This is a mainstream historical fact, perhaps best illustrated by the famous anecdote of Julius Caesar himself being captured by Cilician pirates, who demanded a ransom. Caesar was important enough to be ransomed. What we can expect to happen is to raise the two demands of money or ease and refighted cars. For the average Mediterranean traveller, a merchant or a resident of an unprotected coastal town, falling into the hands of pirates meant a one-way ticket to the slave market. The pirates acted as highly efficient, aggressive and unsanctioned suppliers. They specialised in catching high-value targets, educated Greeks, wealthy Syrians, or just healthy young adults who could be shipped directly to a major distribution hub like Delos, a notorious hub for human trafficking, often operating outside the immediate direct jurisdiction of Roman law. Imagine the transaction. a grizzled pirate captain docking his swift lumbers in a dark cove, meeting a slave dealer, and exchanging a dozen terrified captives for bags of silver or gold. These sales were often quicker, less regulated, and offered the negotiator a high profit margin because the source had no legal ownership rights and simply wanted the captives donned for the fastest possible cash. You were buying a life with no paper trail, only the terrifying knowledge of how they got there. Now let's turn our attention inland, back to the cruel mathematics of Roman finance: debt. We touched upon the legal restrictions on Roman citizens selling themselves or their children. By the later Republic, the archaic institution of nexum, where a citizen could essentially sell his labour and eventually his freedom for get, was abolished or severely curtailed. However, the desperation of poverty is often stronger than the law. You see a haggard farmer, perhaps just north of Rome, who has suffered 2 bad harvests in a row. His land is mortgaged and he can't feed his family. While he can't legally sell himself into perpetual slavery within Rome, there are legalistic and quasi-legal ways around this to acquire bodies for labour. A debt-ridden farmer might indenture himself and his children for a fixed long period of time, perhaps 20 years, to a wealthy patronus in exchange for the cancellation of his yet and a small sum of money. While technically retaining the title of free, the reality of their existence was indistinguishable from slavery for those 2 decades. Their bodies, their labour, and their entire lives were forfeit to the wealthy creditor. The price paid for them was the cancellation of an economic obligation, a transaction of value that bypassed the traditional auction. Here's where we stumble upon a deeply unpleasant, yet common, quirky or fringe tidbit: the highly specialised and highly sinister baby trade. In Roman society, the father paterfamilias had the legal right to reject a newborn child, to refuse to raise it. This act of exposure, expositio, meant leaving the infant outside, often near a temple, dunghill, or a public collection spot, to die or be found. While morally controversial, it was legally permitted, especially in the context of poverty, illegitimacy, or gender preference. Crucially, any person who picked up an abandoned child was legally considered its owner, or at the very least could raise it as their service or ancilla slave. This created an industry of collectors who would frequent these spots, knowing that the healthy abandoned infant was a long-term investment. They would raise the child to adulthood, provide minimal food and shelter, and then sell the now-grown person into the market for full value. The price for this slave was not paid at auction, but was represented by the negligible cost of their upkeep from infancy. You are buying someone whose entire life had been predicated on their eventual sale. And here's a slightly dark joke related to that chilling process. Imagine a mango selling a particularly robust young man. The buyer asks, "What's his background? War captive? Pirate's prize?" The mango chuckles. "Oh no, sir, this one is a Vernet Expositi. Prime vintage. 0 procurement costs, raised on just water and hope. You're paying pure profit on this man's entire life." The pricing for these foundlings was complex. An exposed infant would, of course, have an initial value of essentially 0, but their potential was high. As they grew, their price would appreciate based on their health, intelligence, and looks. A healthy, attractive girl raised this way could fetch a very high price when she reached adolescence. The buyer was essentially acquiring a clean slate, a slave with no memory of freedom, often trained from the crib to servitude. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of infanticide and exposure was a direct economic response to the high cost of raising a child in Rome, or whether it was a social expression of the absolute power of the paterfamilias. Was the baby trade a necessary evil to dispose of unwanted children, or did the profitability of the baby trade encourage the abandonment in the first place? The debate highlights the grim intersection of Roman law, poverty, and economics. We also can't forget the practice of self-sale and desperation. While a Roman citizen couldn't sell himself into chattel slavery, foreigners peregrini who travelled to Roman territory, especially in times of famine in their homelands, sometimes voluntarily sold themselves. They chose a brief, controlled sale into slavery over certain starvation. This was the ultimate, horrifying consumer choice. The price paid here was often low, reflecting the disparate nature of the sale, but it added a steady trickle of individuals to the supply chain who entered bondage not through violence, but through economic collapse. Finally, another subtle continuous source was the inheritance of debt. If a free person was deeply in debt, sometimes the creditors could lay claim not just to the person's assets, but to his dependent family members, selling them to clear the ledger. This was less common in the later empire, but remained a terrifying threat hanging over the less fortunate. So, when the legions halted, the Roman market didn't dry up. Instead, it was sustained by a complex subterranean network of desperation and criminality. Pirates prowling the sea lanes for new inventory, impoverished citizens finding legal loopholes to liquidate their families for debt relief, and, most coldly, the entrepreneurs who profited from the legal disposal of unwanted infants. You realize now that the high price you pay for a fine Greek slave in the Forum might represent the spoils of war, or it might just be the culmination of 20 years of minimal investment in a child found shivering on a riverbank. The economic machinery of slavery was not monolithic. It was a hydra, and for every war captive's head you cut off, 2 more grew back, nourished by poverty and legal ambiguity. We've seen where the bodies come from: the battlefield, the pirate ship, and the cold streets of Rome. Now, let's get into the cruel arithmetic that assigns a monetary value to each one of those bodies. You're walking the market again, but this time you're not just seeing people. You're seeing a vast spectrum of skill and specialization, and that is where the real price differentiation lies. Forget the cheap war captive you saw earlier, the strong but unskilled Gaul. He is at the low end of the scale, essential but easily replaceable. Now, look toward the corner where the more expensive, less physically imposing merchandise is displayed. This is where a slave's brain becomes vastly more valuable than their back. The price of a slave isn't static. It's an economic reflection of their potential contribution to the Roman household or business. A slave is an investment, and like any investment, the return is calculated based on skill, rarity, and maintenance costs. At the base of the pyramid are the unskilled labourers, the field hands rustici, the construction workers, the rowers in the galleys, and the furnace tenders. Their value is determined primarily by their physique, their height, muscle mass, endurance, and visible health. They are the commodity bulk. A healthy, strong man for the farm might cost you between 1,500 and 4,000 sestertii. This is the mainstream historical fact of the market. A strong body was the benchmark price. But move up the hierarchy, and the prices begin to skyrocket based on a single factor: specialization. You see a man wearing a carefully folded toga, his hands unmarked by hard labor. He is a scribe librarius, or a secretary servus ab epistolis, perhaps fluent in both Latin and Greek. He doesn't just know letters. He knows law, administration, and accounting. He can manage your correspondence with governors in distant provinces, keep your complex financial ledgers in order, and draft persuasive speeches. This man, simply because he possesses a rare intellectual skill, is exponentially more valuable than 3 Gauls combined. You might have to pay 25,000 to 50,000 sestertii for a top-tier educated secretary. Why the massive leap? Because a general labourer adds value slowly through muscle power, a skilled accountant or administrator adds value rapidly by protecting and multiplying your existing wealth. He is not a cost, he is a profit centre. Now imagine you own a large vineyard. You could buy 10 unskilled workers for a cheap price, but you'd still need to hire a free man or use your own time to manage them, oversee the harvest, and ensure the wine vats are correctly processed. Or you could buy one highly skilled villicus farm manager, an experienced slave who knows crop rotation, pruning techniques, and how to command the other slaves. This manager might cost you 8,000 to 12,000 sestertii, but he saves you the cost and hassle of constant oversight. You are buying expertise, autonomy, and time. This leads us to a crucial, quirky, or fringe tidbit of Roman economics: the slave physician. Ancient Roman medicine was a mix of the effective, the strange, and the downright dangerous. Many free Romans were deeply suspicious of Greek medical practices. However, having a slave physician servus medicus in your household was a massive status symbol and a practical necessity. These slaves, often highly trained Greeks or Egyptians, could treat your family, your other slaves, thereby preserving your capital investment, and even generate income by treating clients outside the household. A truly excellent slave physician could command a price that rivaled senators, with some fetching over 60,000 sestertii. In a time of high infant mortality and rampant disease, this slave was your most important insurance policy. Their value was a direct calculation of the lives and, therefore, the capital they could save. The irony, of course, is that a free, uneducated charlatan might charge high fees, while a highly skilled, enslaved doctor had his life savings legally owned by his master, despite his superior skills. Let's pause for a moment of levity. You see a buyer looking suspiciously at a slave being advertised as a master chef service caucus. The auctioneer insists he makes a mushroom patina that would make the gods weep. The buyer scoffs. My last cook, who cost me 15,000 sestertii, accidentally seasoned my lampreys with axle grease. I'm not falling for that again. Unless he comes with a written guarantee against all forms of fatal culinary errors, my bid remains at the price of a regular baker. The fear of being poisoned by your own staff was a surprisingly persistent anxiety for the Roman elite, making trust almost as valuable as skill. The intellectual elite of the slave market weren't just administrators. Consider the librarians and tutors, pedagogy. In wealthy Roman homes, children were primarily educated by Greek slaves. The Greek language, philosophy and history were the foundation of a Roman gentleman's education. A tutor who spoke impeccable Greek, was versed in Homer and Plato, and who had a gentle, effective temperament was a priceless commodity. His value wasn't just in his knowledge, but in the social capital he invested in the master's children. He was, literally, raising the next generation of Roman elite. Historians still argue whether the dominance of Greek slaves in the intellectual, teaching and medical fields hindered the development of native Roman scholarship and science, or whether it was simply a pragmatic acknowledgement of Greek cultural supremacy in those areas. The fact remains that if you wanted a top-quality education for your son, you bought the best Greek mind you could find, making the intellectual wealth of the defeated East the highest-priced commodity in the West. The pricing also factored in the risk and longevity of the investment. A slave bought for the silver mines, as we'll explore later, was cheap because his expected lifespan was measured in months, not years. You accepted a high turnover and minimal return on training. A villicus, or a librarius, however, was expected to live a long, relatively healthy life, manage your affairs for decades, and possibly even train his own replacement. His high purchase price was amortized over a much longer, more profitable period. Another important category was the artisan slave. Think of specialized craftsmen, the silversmiths, the fine cabinet makers, the weavers, and the mosaic artists. These slaves didn't just perform labor. They created luxury goods that the master could sell at a considerable profit. If you owned a workshop producing high-quality jewelry, the slave who held the specialized skill was your key asset. The price you paid for him, say 10,000 sestertii, was less than the profit you could realize from a year of his expert craftsmanship. Their price reflected the market value of the luxury goods they produced. Finally, there were the slaves whose skill was purely aesthetic and entertaining. A beautiful trained dancer, a skilled harp player, or a comic actor could fetch an enormous sum, not because they produced tangible wealth, but because they provided prestige and pleasure. Their price was a direct measure of the master's disposable income and his desire to impress his peers. These luxury slaves were often meticulously groomed, trained from a young age, and could become incredibly spoiled and influential figures in the household, sometimes costing more than a highly educated administrator. You realize, watching the transactions, that the Roman slave market was a brutally efficient algorithm. It didn't care about a person's inherent worth, only their potential utility. Every single person on that block, from the silent field hand to the pompous Greek poet, had their entire life reduced to a single number, a price tag reflecting their skill, rarity, and ability to generate profit or prestige for their new master. The journey from a war camp to a comfortable Roman villa was paved with the currency of specialization. We've explored the high-priced world of skilled labor, the accountants and the doctors. But before a mango slave dealer can determine if a captive is worth 50,000 sestertii as a tutor, he first has to establish the baseline value. This foundation price is determined by the most straightforward and often brutal criteria: age, gender, and physique. You're back on the auction block, watching the cold, transactional assessment of raw human material. Think of it like an ancient Roman algorithm for basic human worth. A buyer doesn't start with, is he good at Greek? But rather, is he going to live long enough to justify the purchase price? This fundamental calculation is a mainstream historical fact that governed every sale. The primary factor, the clearest determinant of initial value, is age. Generally, the optimal price was commanded by slaves in their late teens to early 20s. Why? Because this age group represented the perfect balance of maximal working years ahead of them and a minimal period of prior upkeep. A 20-year-old male slave was already fully grown, strong, and capable of immediate heavy labour, but could be expected to provide 2 or 3 decades of service before his body started to fail. This longevity made him a secure investment. Contrast that with a child slave. While children puri or pule were generally cheaper, perhaps 800 to 1,000, 500 sestati for a healthy infant, they required years of feeding, clothing and training before they could generate any meaningful return on investment. They were a gamble. A child might die of fever, might be physically frail, or might develop into an unsuitable worker. However, if they did survive and flourish, they could be highly prized as verne homeborn slaves, integrated into the household and highly trusted. So, children were a long-term, high-risk, high-reward investment, often favoured by the wealthiest families. On the opposite end of the age spectrum were the older slaves. A man or woman past their 40th year saw their price drop sharply. They might possess great skill, a lifetime of experience as a cook or a manager, but their working lifespan was limited, and they were more prone to illness. Their value was often determined less by their future productivity and more by their immediate specialist utility, or the sheer weight of their experience, which could still command a reasonable price, but never the premiums of youth. Next, let's consider the harsh reality of gender. While we might assume absolute parity based on physical strength, the Roman market assigned different values to men and women, based entirely on their intended use, and this often saw male slaves as a bulk, commanding higher prices than female slaves. Male slaves were overwhelmingly destined for hard physical labour, the farms, the mines, the construction sites and public works. Their primary asset was brute strength and endurance. The highest prices for male slaves were often reserved for those who were robust, tall, and appeared disciplined. Their value was a direct function of the muscle they could apply to an economic task. Female slaves had a much broader and often more precarious range of potential roles. In the lower tiers, they worked in laundry, milling, and field work, where their value was comparable to a lower-tier male labourer. However, in the domestic sphere, specialised female slaves could fetch higher prices. A highly skilled Notrix wet nurse, a capable ancilla housemaid who was trustworthy, or a textrix weaver whose hands produced valuable cloth, could rival the price of a mid-level male worker. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The highest prices for female slaves were often for those valued not for their domestic skills, but for their aesthetic or reproductive potential. The beautiful young woman might fetch a massive premium, far exceeding the value of a strong male labourer, if purchased for companionship, prestige, or for the sex trade. These prices were entirely divorced from productive economic output and were purely driven by luxury demand. Similarly, a female slave known to be fertile and a good mother could command a higher price because she represented a guaranteed supply of future slaves, the vernae, thereby increasing her master's long-term capital. This gender valuation leads us to a bit of a grim joke. A Roman buyer is examining a sturdy female slave. He says to the mango, "She seems strong enough for the filling shop, but her face, it's quite plain." The mango sighs. "Ah, but Gaius, that's a feature, not a defect. She won't attract the attention of your dissolute nephew, nor will she get distracted by foolish notions of love. You're paying extra for reliable indifference." The joke, of course, relies on the brutal idea that a slave's lack of attractiveness could be marketed as a positive for efficiency and control. Finally, we come to physique and health, the absolute make-or-break factor for the baseline price. Every slave for sale had to undergo a thorough physical examination. The auctioneer or mango was obligated by law to disclose any significant, non-obvious defects. A healthy slave, certified by a scroll of warranty tabula, would command the full market price. The buyer was primarily looking for stenoma and strength, indicated by well-developed musculature and a lack of visible scars from chronic injury. Clear health, absence of chronic diseases like epilepsy, tuberculosis, or leprosy. Good teeth, an easy indicator of general health and age. Absence of fuga, they must not have an established reputation as a runaway risk. If a slave had a defect that was not disclosed, the buyer could later invoke the Aediles Edict, a set of consumer protection laws, to demand a refund or return the slave within 6 months. This is a mainstream historical fact. The state actively regulated the sale of human property to ensure fair dealing between Roman citizens. The law didn't protect the slave, it protected the capital of the buyer. A slave known to be epileptic or prone to fuga running away would be sold at a severe discount, sometimes a quarter of the normal price. This markdown reflected the risk the buyer was assuming. Remember that earlier quirk? Sometimes these defected slaves were sold wearing a little hat, the pileus. explicitly warning the buyer of the risk and nullifying the seller's liability. Historians still argue whether the Ideals Edict, which regulated disclosure of defects, ultimately led to better treatment of slaves by encouraging masters to maintain the health and temperament of their human property, or if it simply led to more sophisticated forms of deception during the sale process. Did it raise the bar for basic care, or just create a better paper trail for the mangones? The simple price, therefore, was a calculation of expected labour return. A young, strong, healthy male in his prime was the gold standard, the average against which all other prices were calculated. A child was discounted for the long wait, an old person for the short service, an unhealthy person for the risk of capital loss, and a woman's price often depended on whether she was viewed as a producer of goods labour or a luxury breeder. You watch as an exhausted-looking man is paraded before the buyers. He's about 30, but his frame is lean, almost gaunt. The auctioneer tries to compensate for the poor physique by stressing his background as a farmhand from a desirable region. The bidding is sluggish. He's discounted because the physical evidence of his labour, his warm body, suggests a diminished return. He doesn't meet the ideal physical profile, and so his price settles at the lower end of the spectrum, perhaps 2,000 sestorii. He's not cheap because he's a bad person. He's cheap because he's a low-risk, low-potential investment. In this market, your strength is your currency, your youth is your bond, and your health is your collateral. We've established the baseline price for human property. The strong young male labourer is the market standard. But now we move beyond mere utility and into the realm of luxury and status. You're leaving the dusty corner of the field hands and entering the refined, often whispered about section of the market, where the price tag is inflated not by a strong back, but by a certain curve of the nose, the colour of the hair, or the exotic mystery of a distant homeland. The concept is simple. In the Roman world, wealth wasn't just about having money. It was about displaying it, and nothing displayed a Roman's wealth and cosmopolitan tastes quite like the possession of beautiful or rare human beings. This demand for aesthetics and exoticism is a crucial mainstream historical fact that completely decoupled price from productive economic function. First, let's talk about beauty. A slave of exceptional physical attractiveness, male or female, could command a price exponentially higher than an average one, regardless of skill. We are talking about premiums of 200%, 300%, or even more. While a strong field hand might be 3,000 sestertii, a singularly beautiful youth could easily fetch 20,000 to 50,000 sestertii. This massive valuation was purely a function of desire and prestige. These individuals were purchased not to press olives or keep ledgers, but to serve as personal attendants, concubines, companions, or as living art objects for the master's household. Their primary job was to reflect the master's taste and success. Think of the specialized slaves who served purely as decorative figures at banquets, perhaps trained to look solemn and statuesque while standing behind a dining couch. Their only skill was their presence. The trade in attractive slaves, especially young women ancillae or puellae, was a constant source of massive profit for the mangones. The buyer, usually a wealthy elite, was essentially purchasing a piece of living luxury, a signifier that his wealth was so vast he could afford to spend a fortune on something purely ornamental. Now layer on the premium of exotic origin. Romans were fiercely proud of their culture, yet they were obsessed with the external. The further away a slave came from, the more unique their features, the higher the price they could potentially fetch. It was a bizarre form of ancient collecting. Consider the fascination with slaves from the fringes of the empire. Germans were prized for their height, fair hair, and perceived loyalty once tamed. They were often employed as imposing bodyguards or doorkeepers. Bitterns were a novelty due to their remote origin, often sold with a heavy price tag just because they were rare and showed the buyer had connections far afield. The ultimate status symbols often came from the east. Nubians or Ethiopians, slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, were highly valued for their dark skin, which was often considered striking and beautiful, especially when contrasted with the pale skin of their Roman masters. Similarly, slaves from India or Persia, though incredibly rare, could command astronomical prices. You weren't just buying a person, you were buying a story, a geographic marvel to show off at a dinner party. Oh, my new service? He walked all the way from the Indus. Terribly expensive, of course. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes the exotic origin was entirely manufactured. A slave dealer might deliberately dress up an otherwise average captive in the distinctive flamboyant clothing of a distinct, more prestigious culture, or even dye their hair or use cosmetics to enhance a desired feature, say, lightening their skin or darkening their eyes, to artificially inflate their perceived rarity. This fraudulent marketing practice was so common that laws were eventually put in place under the Ideal's edict to protect buyers from being duped by such cosmetic enhancements or false origin claims. The market was so driven by superficiality that dealers had to be legally constrained from excessive aesthetic deception. Let's inject a little levity into this grim reality. Imagine a mango trying to sell a very ordinary-looking fellow. He whispers to a buyer, "This man, Gaius, is from a province so remote, the Roman army hasn't even invented a name for it yet. It's exclusive. His name is Bob, which in his native tongue means philosopher king of the hidden prairies. And note the price is higher because of the expense of the rare dyes I used on his tunic. He's a luxury import, I assure you." The dealer's attempt to turn mundanity into mosaic underscores the ridiculous nature of the exotic premium. The demand for certain looks also crossed over into the entertainment sector. If you were buying a gladiator, the price was primarily determined by muscle and ferocity, but for a performer, a mime, a dancer, or an actor, beauty and a certain exotic flair were essential. An elegant live dancer from Spain, for example, would be significantly more expensive than a local Roman-born dancer, simply because she offered an authentically foreign performance. Historians still argue whether the Roman elite's obsession with exotic slaves was a sign of true cultural integration and open-mindedness, or simply a manifestation of imperial arrogance, reducing the defeated world into manageable, decorative trophies. Was it appreciation, or merely the ultimate form of commodification of the other? The debate highlights the complex, contradictory nature of Roman universalism. The price disparity due to beauty and origin also created a social hierarchy among the slaves themselves. The highly prized, well-groomed, exotic personal attendant might live a life of relative ease, enjoying better food, clothes, and less demanding labour, whereas the local plain field hand might suffer brutal conditions. Their market price set their standard of living, creating a clear class structure within the enslaved population. A beautiful slave was a massive capital investment, and therefore an asset to be protected. The average slave was often a disposable expense. Recall the educated Greek slave we discussed earlier. Now, imagine a Greek slave who is also exceptionally handsome and fluent in poetry. His price doesn't just add his intellectual value, say 25,000 sestertii, to his base price, say 5,000 sestertii. No, the beauty and skill multiply the price. He is now a flawless luxury good, combining the utility of the scholar with the aesthetic appeal of a statue, easily hitting the higher limits of the market, potentially 70,000 sestertii or more. The more qualities of rarity and value you piled onto a single person, the higher the market was willing to reach. The buying of exotic slaves was often driven by a form of ancient keeping up with the Joneses. If your neighbour, Mucius, had a striking blonde German slave guarding his doorway, you felt compelled to acquire a dark-skinned Nubian to serve your wine, signalling that your network and wallet reached even further than his. The price you paid was a measure of your competitive status within the Roman elite. Ultimately, this specialized corner of the market reminds you that human commodification in Rome was never just about labor. It was deeply entangled with vanity, fashion, and social maneuvering. You were witnessing the purchase of status made flesh, where human beings were transformed into the ultimate luxury accessories, their price reflecting the depth of their master's ego, not the breadth of their humanity. We've established the various market prices for human beings, from the discounted field hand to the highly inflated exotic beauty. But the economic reality of slavery in Rome wasn't just about the purchase price. It was a complex living relationship, often defined by a strange contradictory legal concept known as the peculium. You are now looking beyond the auction block and into the daily operation of a wealthy Roman estate. The system of the peculium is a mainstream historical fact that completely alters the master-slave dynamic, transforming the slave from a near tool into a pseudo-economic agent. What is a peculium? Legally speaking, it was a fund or a small amount of property that a master allowed his slave or a son still under the father's absolute power, the patria potestas, to manage and use. Crucially, the master legally owned the peculium. It was technically his property, but the slave was given the practical right to control the assets within it, to trade, to lend, and to profit from them, largely unsupervised. Think of it as a master giving his slave a personal business account, complete with operating capital, but reserving the right to withdraw the funds at any time. This arrangement was not born out of benevolence. It was born out of economic pragmatism. A slave with a financial incentive is a better, more industrious worker. By allowing a slave to trade, run a small shop, or manage a specific aspect of the master's business, like a shipping venture or a bakery, the master stood to gain substantially more profit than he would from a purely coerced labourer. The peculium turned the slave's ingenuity and entrepreneurial drive into an asset. Imagine a slave who is a skilled baker. Instead of just milling flour for the household, the master grants him a peculium to set up a small bakery in Rome. The baker runs the shop, sells bread to the public, and uses the profits to buy better ingredients or hire a sub-slave service vicarius. The majority of the profits flow back to the master, but the slave is allowed to keep a percentage or simply keep his peculium growing. This structure made the slave more motivated, more responsible, and ultimately more valuable to his master. The size and nature of the peculium varied wildly. For a high-status slave, a sophisticated financial manager or a skilled artisan, the peculium could be substantial, consisting of cash, goods, land, houses, and even other slaves. For a simple field hand, the peculium might be tiny, a few denarii gained from selling eggs or excess produce on the side. The economic worth of a slave was therefore not just their initial purchase price, but the size and earning potential of the peculium they managed. And here is the most crucial function of the peculium that directly relates to the slave's price and ultimate fate. It was the primary vehicle for buying freedom. The accumulated fund was the slave's savings account toward manumission, freedom. If a slave successfully accumulated enough funds in their peculium, they could enter into an agreement with their master to purchase their own freedom, peculium pro libertate. The negotiated price for manumission was often significantly higher than the slave's original market price, reflecting the value of their lost future labour and the master's own potential profit from the peculum. A skilled slave who cost 15,000 sestertii might have to pay 30,000 sestertii to gain his freedom. This meant the master made a clean profit on the initial investment, plus decades of labour and a handsome final sum. It was a win-win for the master and the ultimate motivator for the slave. This system created an incredibly complex and slightly uncomfortable moral and legal paradox. The master was essentially selling the same property the slave's body and labour twice, first when he purchased him, and second when he sold him his freedom. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The peculium could be used by the slave not only to buy freedom for themselves, but also for their family members, their wife, children, or sometimes even a contubinium slave partner. This led to heart-breaking financial prioritization, where a slave might spend decades of their life labouring tirelessly, not for their own freedom, but for the emancipation of a loved one. The ultimate price calculation then became about balancing personal liberty against familial bonds, or within the framework of the master's peculium ledger. Imagine a slave manager who was grown rich managing his master's shipping fleet, haggling over the price of his freedom. The master says, "I demand 50,000 sestertii for your manumission." The slave shakes his head. "Master, if you recall, I advised you to invest heavily in the grain trade last year. You made a profit of 100,000 sestertii on my advice. I am willing to offer you a mere 25,000 sestertii and a beautifully crafted marble fountain for the courtyard. Take the deal. It's a massive capital gain, even with my generous discount." The sheer power dynamic of a slave negotiating his freedom based on his contribution to his master's wealth is an absurdity only Roman law could accommodate. Historians still argue whether the peculium was a mechanism that humanized Roman slavery by providing a realistic path to freedom and recognizing the inherent agency of the enslaved person, or if it was merely a cynical, brilliant form of economic exploitation that tricked the enslaved into working harder for the master's ultimate benefit. Was it a subtle stepping stone to liberty, or the perfect capitalist cage? The existence of the peculium also impacted the slave's market value upon sale to a new master. If a slave with a large, successful peculium was sold, the purchase price would reflect the value of that fund. The new master inherited not just the slave, but the successful business enterprise attached to him. This made the slave an even more highly valued asset, increasing the initial purchase price far beyond their basic skill set. This system also placed a burden on the slave, as he could be held liable for debts incurred by the peculium. Although the master was the ultimate owner, the law allowed creditors to pursue the peculium if the slave's business failed. This meant the slave was constantly taking risks, essentially gambling with his own potential freedom. You see a wealthy Patronus looking at his slave, the aforementioned baker, who has successfully saved enough in his peculium to be nearly free. The master is considering selling him instead of freeing him. The price for this slave would be enormous. Why? Because the buyer would acquire not just a skilled baker, but a baker who is disciplined, loyal since he's been working toward a goal, and who has proven entrepreneurial spirit. The peculium adds layers of intangible value, proven trustworthiness and ambition that no amount of flogging could produce. The peculium was the master key to understanding the full long-term economic price of a slave. It was a self-financing engine of production and a self-liquidating mechanism for manumission, demonstrating that the Romans, while morally accepting of chattel slavery, were shrewd enough to recognize that a small taste of economic freedom yielded a massive return on their human investment. We've explored the internal factors that determined a slave's price: skill, looks, health, and the strange freedom by savings mechanism of the peculium. But all those price tags, the 3,000 sestertii for the field hand, the 50,000 sestertii for the tutor, were denominated in Roman currency, and that currency itself was constantly in flux. To truly understand what Romans paid for slaves, you have to understand the broader economic stage, currency, inflation, and the ancient art of commodity exchange. You stand now in the Roman marketplace not just as a buyer of human property, but as an amateur numismatist. The value of your purchase is inextricably linked to the purity of the metal in your hand. The Roman monetary system, centered around the denarius silver and the sestertius brass bronze, usually denoted in accounts as HS, provided the standard of exchange. For centuries, the value of the coinage was relatively stable because the state maintained a high degree of metallurgical purity. A silver denarius was, fundamentally, worth the silver it contained. This stability allowed for predictable pricing of all commodities, including slaves. However, a mainstream historical fact that dramatically impacted the price of everything, including human life, was the long, slow, and devastating process of debasement. The Roman state, especially from the time of Nero onward, increasingly began to reduce the actual silver content in the denarius to fund its massive military and civil expenditures. They were essentially minting more coins from the same amount of precious metal. In the early empire, the denarius was nearly 95% silver. By the 3rd century CE, it could be as low as 5%. This is inflation in its most brutal, overt form. What does debasement mean for the slave market? If your coin contains less valuable metal, you need more of those coins to purchase a commodity whose intrinsic value remains unchanged. As the purity of the denarius plummeted, the nominal price of a slave, the number written on the ledger in sestertii, skyrocketed. A slave who might have cost 3,000 sestertii in the prosperous age of Augustus might be listed for 30,000 sestertii a century or two later, even though his actual value in pure silver or gold had only modestly changed. You were paying more, but you were paying in less trustworthy money. Historians still argue whether the extreme late imperial inflation caused by debasement led to an increase in manumission, as masters preferred to accept large, rapidly devaluing sums of cash from their slaves' peculium rather than keep a valuable physical asset in an unstable economy. Did bad currency inadvertently lead to more freedom? This instability is why the truly high-value transactions, the purchase of an estate, a large tract of land, or a prize Greek doctor worth 60,000 plus sestertii, were often settled or at least benchmarked in gold. The aureus was the gold standard, the bedrock of Roman finance, and its purity was generally maintained for longer. If a slave was sold for 50 aurei, that price held its intrinsic value, regardless of how many devalued denarii it took to match that weight in gold. When you purchased a high-value slave, you were paying in a metal that resisted the whims of the emperor's mint. Now, let's step away from coinage and look at the ancient system of commodity exchange. Sometimes, particularly in frontier provinces or in times of acute currency shortage, slaves were priced and purchased not with coins, but with barter. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit of the trade, especially prevalent during the later, more chaotic imperial periods. Imagine you are a grain merchant in Egypt, and you need a new dock worker. You might not have the 5,000 sestertii in stable coinage needed. Instead, you might trade 200 measures of high-quality Egyptian grain for the slave. The price of the slave, then, becomes the market value of the grain at that exact moment. Other high-value commodities used in exchange included valuable textiles, olive oil, and sometimes even specialized tools or weapons. This created a wildly fluctuating price structure across the vast empire. A slave might be cheap in a province that had a massive surplus of grain, the trade commodity, but expensive in a region that valued oil more highly. The price was always relative to the local commodity and the desperate need for liquidity. This requires a buyer to be a shrewd judge of not just human flesh, but also the fluctuating global prices of basic foodstuffs. A frontier mango is selling a strong Thracian. A buyer offers a huge pile of cured fish. The mango stares at the goods. Cured fish? I need gold. Do I look like I'm running a cow farm? My price is 300 gold ori, or 5,000 amphorae of the finest Falernian wine. Not enough fish to cause a week-long plague. The humour lies in the Roman distaste for low-status, overly perishable barter goods, highlighting the preference for high-value, easily transportable commodities for exchange. The relative value of a slave could also be indexed against a key commodity that was always in high demand: grain. Mainstream sources suggest that the price of a slave could sometimes be measured in lifetime food provision. If a slave costs you 3,000 sestertii, and it takes 300 sestertii a year to feed him, you need 10 years of his labour just to cover the initial purchase and his upkeep. This simple calculation of break-even point meant that when grain prices rose sharply due to famine, the effective cost of owning and maintaining a slave dramatically increased, even if the purchase price remained the same. Conversely, a slave could be sold for debt. In this scenario, the price paid for the slave was the cancellation of a financial obligation. If a debtor owed a creditor 10,000 sestertii, the creditor might accept a talented slave valued at that amount, thereby making the debt the currency of the transaction. This was a form of asset transfer that bypassed the need for immediate cash in the market. Historians still argue whether the increasing reliance on commodity exchange and debt transfer in the late empire, as opposed to stable coinage, reflected a loss of central authority in Rome and a fragmentation of the integrated economy, or if it was simply a pragmatic local adaptation to the severe currency shortages and debasement that plagued the 3rd and 4th centuries. The long-term takeaway is this: the number on the slave's price tag was always a moving target, dependent on the integrity of the Roman mint and the health of the local economy. Whether you were paying an increasingly worthless brass, solid gold, or a large pile of cured hams, the value equation for the Roman master remained constant. Purchase price plus maintenance must always be outweighed by the slave's lifetime output of profit, luxury, or status. The slave market, in essence, was a brutally honest barometer of the economic health of the entire Roman world. We have navigated the volatile seas of currency and barter, but now it's time to anchor ourselves in the stratosphere of the slave market, where prices defy the logic of mere physical labour. We are talking about the intellectual elite of the enslaved population, specifically the highly educated Greek tutor, doctor, or secretary whose mind was literally worth more than a dozen farms. You are watching a bidding war unfold for a single man. He is probably slight of build, perhaps middle-aged, and his hands show the signs of a life spent handling papyrus and wax tablets, not a plough. He is a Greek slave, a native speaker of the language of philosophy, science, and high culture. The price has already soared past 40,000 sestertii, reaching levels that only the wealthiest senatorial families or the most ambitious new millionaires can afford. This astronomical price is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the Roman cultural paradox. They conquered Greece militarily, yet they were utterly captivated by and dependent upon Greek civilization. Roman education and intellectual life were almost entirely run on Greek intellectual capital. To be an educated Roman gentleman meant being fluent in Greek and well-versed in Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. And the best way to ensure this education was to own the educator. A top-tier Greek slave was an investment in social capital and prestige. He was not just a tutor pedagogos, he was a living library, a cultural ambassador, and a public statement. If your son's tutor was a renowned rhetorician or mathematician, it reflected brilliantly on your discernment and wealth. You were purchasing direct access to the cultural high ground. The value of the Greek tutor was calculated based on several factors: language fluency, impeccable command of both Latin and Greek, often with a regional dialect that signalled high status, e.g. Attic Greek. Specialization. Was he merely a reader, or was he also a skilled astronomer, architect, or philosopher? Multi-talented individuals commanded a higher premium. Reputation and temperament. A tutor with a gentle, effective teaching style who had successfully educated the sons of other elite families was immensely more valuable than a harsh, irritable scholar. The price included a warranty of quality. Consider the market for a servus medicus slave physician, also predominantly Greek. Roman citizens were often reluctant to practice medicine, viewing it as a messy, low-status profession. Consequently, the most skilled doctors in Rome were often enslaved Greeks, Egyptians or others from the highly advanced Hellenistic world. An excellent slave physician was invaluable because he protected the master's primary assets, his family and his other expensive slaves. If a slave doctor could save the life of a 30,000 sesterce steward, the master had saved a fortune. A truly outstanding physician might be worth up to 60,000 sestertii, making him one of the most expensive non-performing assets a Roman could own. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The very highest-priced intellectual slaves sometimes came with a kind of intellectual insurance policy. Wealthy buyers, recognizing the rarity of these skills, would sometimes purchase an older, highly educated slave, along with a younger Greek slave, specifically for the purpose of serving as an apprentice to the master. The younger slave would learn the trade, be it medicine, architecture or rhetoric, thereby ensuring the master's investment was preserved across generations. The price paid for the pair would be significantly higher, reflecting the long-term guarantee of specialized labor. The demand for these intellectual slaves was so intense that it occasionally sparked a bidding frenzy that inflated prices to absurd levels. There are records, though potentially embellished, of prices reaching 100,000 sestertii for uniquely gifted individuals, a sum that could easily buy an entire block of modest city apartments in Rome. This was a form of conspicuous consumption, not just buying a luxury, but buying a unique, irreplaceable human talent. A master is complaining to his friend about his new Greek tutor, who cost him a fortune. I paid 50,000 sestertii for him. He's a brilliant philosopher and knows 6 languages. His friend asks, "So what's the problem?" The master sighs dramatically. "He keeps trying to prove to my son that the concept of patria potestas is inherently irrational and morally flawed. I paid for an education, not a potential family rebellion." The humour lies in the Roman anxiety that the very intellect they prized might turn against the foundation of their power structure. This elite market also had significant legal implications. A master who was forced to sell an educated slave due to poverty was often viewed with pity or disdain, as it was the equivalent of selling off the family jewels. Conversely, a master who treated his intellectual slaves poorly and thereby ruined their health or spirit was seen as a fool, destroying valuable capital. Historians still argue whether the high cost of skilled Greek slaves made the institution of slavery more palatable for the Roman elite, by allowing them to rationalize that the most refined and complex roles in society were still performed by the enslaved, thereby confirming their own privileged status as mere managers rather than labourers. Did the high value of Greek intellectual property make Roman slavery appear less barbaric to those who benefited from it? The sheer economic efficiency of the system is undeniable. Why pay a free, arrogant Greek scholar a massive annual salary, which he might take and use to leave Rome? Better to pay a large one-time purchase price for a slave, deign his services for life or until manumission, which would require another large payment, and have absolute legal control. The high price was a reflection of the long-term cost-saving and total legal security that a skilled slave offered over a free employee. You realize that the price of an educated Greek tutor wasn't simply about the transfer of knowledge. It was the price of cultural assimilation, the cost of elite status maintenance, and the ultimate economic expression of the winner dictating the terms to the conquered. The Greek intellectual might wear a slave's collar, but his price tag spoke volumes about his true indispensable value to the Roman world. We have measured the intellectual asset of the Greek tutor. Now, we plunge into the high-risk, high-reward world of flesh and steel, the gladiator. You are no longer in the dusty forum of Rome, but in the specialized training yard, the ludus, where human beings are bought, conditioned and priced based on their potential to provide bloody, spectacular entertainment. The gladiator market represents a unique, deeply specialized and immensely profitable sector of the slave economy. The price paid for a gladiator was utterly divorced from utility. They produced no goods and skill they destroy rather than create, and was instead based entirely on their entertainment value and potential for crowd appeal. This highly focused market is a crucial mainstream historical fact of Roman public life. The typical gladiator was often a war captive from a notoriously fierce tribe like Gauls or Thracians, or a condemned criminal, damati ad ludum. When first bought as a raw recruit tirones, their price could be quite low, perhaps comparable to an average field hand, say 3,000 to 5,000 sister. This low initial price reflected the high risk involved. The slave might die in training, might lack the necessary ferocity or discipline, or might simply be unsuitable for combat. However, the investment was made not in the man, but in the training. Once purchased by a lanista, the owner and manager of the ludus, the gladiator was fed, housed, and subjected to rigorous specialized training. This conditioning process was a significant capital expenditure for the lanista. A gladiator who survived training and showed promise became exponentially more valuable. The price of a gladiator was realized not in a single sale, but in the rental fees and endorsement fees paid by magistrates, wealthy citizens, or even the emperor, who sponsored the games. A lanista would rent out his star performers for huge sums. A novice might rent for a modest fee, but a proven champion, a primus pallus, could command a rental fee of 10,000 to 50,000 sesterti for a single day's spectacle. The ultimate price of the gladiator was the cumulative rental income he generated over his fighting career. This created a massive economic incentive for the lanista to protect his investment. Despite the popular image of gladiators being utterly disposable, the champion was an extremely high-value, highly protected asset. You don't destroy an asset worth 50,000 sesterti lightly. This is why gladiators often received excellent medical care and high-protein diets. They were a financial portfolio. A key factor in the gladiators' valuation was their specialization, their armatura. A retiarius net fighter required dexterity and speed, while a murmillo, heavily armed, required brute strength and stamina. A successful lanista had to shrewdly purchase the right human material for the right armura. Here is a crucial, quirky, or fringe tidbit. The blood money paid by the sponsor to the lanista for the death of a gladiator was usually far less than the potential long-term rental income the fighter could generate. For a champion, the sponsor might have to pay a substantial sum, perhaps half the gladiator's estimated market value, to compensate the lanista for the loss of his capital. This economic reality often served as a subtle counterweight to the crowd's bloodlust. The gesture of the thumb down was not just a signal for death, it was a signal for a massive payout to the lanista. Let's pause for a bit of dark levity. A lanista is negotiating the rental of his prize gladiator, a huge, terrifying gore. The sponsor balks at the price. 50,000 sesterti for a single fight? That's outrageous. The lanista leans in and whispers, "Ah, but Marcus, he's not just a fighter. He's a brand. He's been featured on the best pottery lamps. His sweat is bottled and sold to ladies as a love potion. And he has a perfect 12-0 record. You are buying guaranteed spectacle, not just a man. And remember, if he dies, you owe me another 25,000. A joke highlights how the gladiator became a celebrity, and their economic value transcended the arena itself. The greatest value lay in the reputation and fan base of the gladiator. A fighter who consistently drew huge crowds and elicited strong emotional reactions became a star, commanding the highest rental fees. A sponsor knew that renting a star gladiator was the fastest way to gain political popularity or public favour. The price, therefore, was a reflection of the gladiator's ability to generate political capital for his temporary master, the sponsor of the games. Historians still argue whether the spectacle of the arena served as a necessary social pressure release valve, distracting the Roman populace from political unrest and economic hardship, or if it was a deep, culturally inherent expression of Roman values that glorified violence and domination. Did the massive investment in the gladiator market stabilize or merely reflect the state's social ills? The gladiator market also involved specialized purchasing of slaves for other forms of public entertainment, beast fighters, venaturas, and actors. These slaves, who fought animals or participated in theatrical productions ludisque and icci, were often cheaper than the elite gladiators, but still commanded a premium over average labourers, because they required specialized training and their services were high profile, even if high risk. When a gladiator was manumitted, either by the crowd's will or by the lanista's decision, often after years of service and high profit, he was granted the rudis, a wooden sword. The lamista was sacrificing a huge revenue-generating asset, often for public goodwill, or simply because the fighter was past his physical prime. The price of that freedom to the lanista was the loss of his most valuable human investment. The journey of a gladiator, from a cheap war captive to a high-priced champion, epitomizes the Roman capacity to transform human life into a highly refined, yet utterly brutal form of capital investment. His price was the measure of the crowd's bloodlust and the sponsor's political ambition. We've toured the high-stakes, violent economy of the arena. Now, let's step inside the heart of the Roman home. the kitchen, and the domestic staff. You are now assessing the price of slaves, whose value is determined not by brute force or abstract philosophy, but by their ability to provide comfort, sustenance, and meticulously ordered service. This is the market for the household slave, and it represents a steady, reliable, and crucial investment for the Roman middle and upper classes. The domestic sphere was a vast, specialized hierarchy. A large senatorial household might employ hundreds of slaves, each with a specific title and task: the atriensis doorkeeper, the cubicularius chamberlain, the ornatrix hairdresser, and the pedicircus footman. The price of these slaves was determined by the rarity and reliability of their specialization. The most vital and consistently high-priced domestic slaves were those involved in food preparation. A Roman dinner party, the cena, was the ultimate expression of social standing, and its success depended entirely on the enslaved staff. A highly skilled cook could command a price ranging from 6,000 to 15,000 sestertii, placing him well above the value of an average field hand. This is a mainstream historical fact that showcases the value placed on culinary expertise. Why so expensive? Because the cook was the master of culinary chemistry, transforming basic ingredients into the complex multi-course meals that defined Roman luxury. The cook's reputation directly enhanced the master's reputation. A bad cook was a source of great embarrassment. A brilliant one was a mark of supreme sophistication. The price paid for a cook often included a tacit guarantee of their ability to manage a complex kitchen, understand seasoning, and, crucially, to avoid poisoning the family. The best cooks were often foreigners, especially from Greece or the East, who brought exotic recipes and techniques, adding that desirable layer of exotic origin premium to their price. Next to the cook was the baker pastor. While perhaps slightly less prestigious than the cocus, a skilled slave baker was essential, especially in city homes that didn't rely on public bakeries. The baker's value was steady, ensuring the reliable supply of fresh bread, a staple of the Roman diet. Their price was a calculation of their consistent, necessary output. The highest-priced domestic slaves, however, were the administrators, the dispenser to cashier treasurer, and the vilica female manager of the household, commanded immense sums. These individuals didn't perform physical labour. They managed all the other slaves, controlled the household accounts, handled purchases, and ensured the smooth running of the entire dance. They were, essentially, the human capital that protected the master's entire wealth. A dispensator with an excellent reputation for honesty and skill could easily fetch 20,000 sestertii or more. The high price was a direct reflection of the potential loss a dishonest or incompetent manager could inflict. This reliance on specialized domestic labor leads us to a crucial, quirky or fringe tidbit: the highly refined market for slaves that served purely to enhance the master's appearance and hygiene. Take the tonsor barber, the calidus who smoothed away body hair, and the unker who applied oils in the baths. These services were performed by highly skilled, often very expensive slaves, whose value was aesthetic. A mistake by the barber could ruin a man's appearance. An error by the ornatrix could spoil a woman's entire social outing. Their price, therefore, was tied to the master's delicate social image. Let's offer a little domestic levity. A wealthy Roman is showing off his new, highly specialized slave who cost 10,000 sestertii. His friend asks, what is his talent? Is he a doctor? A writer? The master sighs dramatically. No, he is my servus post coenam. His sole, incredibly expensive function is to walk behind me after dinner and gently remind me not to belch during polite conversation. I assure you it's the best investment I've ever made in social acceptance. The joke highlights the ridiculous lengths the elite would go to purchase propriety. Historians still argue whether the extreme specialization within the domestic slave workforce, where one slave might only be responsible for lighting lamps, servus ablucionis, was a true mark of Roman efficiency, or if it was merely a form of conspicuous consumption, demonstrating that the master had so many slaves he could afford to give each one a trivial, hyper-specific job. Did it boost productivity, or was it simply an expensive status symbol? The pricing for these service slaves also factored in their loyalty and discretion. A cubicularius chamberlain who slept outside the master's bedroom was privy to intimate family secrets. His high price included a premium for his expected trustworthiness. If a slave was known to be discreet, his price would increase significantly, as the buyer was purchasing silence as much as service. The sale of a large, well-trained domestic familiar staff was always a complex transaction. The ability to buy an entire, cohesive unit, a cook, a manager, and a dozen staff would work together harmoniously, commanded a huge premium over buying individuals separately. The buyer was paying for instant infrastructure and avoiding the chaos of breaking in a new, disparate group of people. In the economy of the Roman home, the price paid for a slave was less about their physical capacity and more about their contribution to the master's status, comfort, and financial security. The cook ensured a fine cena, the treasurer protected the wealth, and the barber maintained the public image. They were the expensive, indispensable cogs in the machinery of elite Roman life. We shift abruptly now from the polished marble floors of the Roman domus and the high-priced chatter of the dinner party to the absolute nadir of the Roman slave economy, the mines and quarries. You leave the sunlight and descend with me into the suffocating darkness of a Spanish silver mine, or a quarry in Egypt, places where the price paid for a slave was the absolute lowest, reflecting their appalling conditions and tragically brief life expectancy. This sector of the market was driven by a brutal, simple equation: maximum back-breaking output for minimum upfront capital investment. The slave destined for the mines, servus metallicus, or quarries, was typically the cheapest human chattel available. They were usually war captives, deemed unsuitable for more skilled or domestic work. The sullen, the physically scarred, the unruly, or those who simply failed to sell at a high price. Their value rarely exceeded 1,000 to 2,500 sestertii, placing them at the bottom rung of the pricing ladder. The reason for this low price is simple. The risk of capital loss was nearly 100%. These slaves were disposable. The conditions in the Roman mines were notoriously lethal, a mainstream historical fact documented by ancient writers like Diodorus Siculus, who described the work as a death sentence. Slaves worked chained, often naked, in cramped, oxygen-starved tunnels, extracting gold, silver, lead, or copper. Death came quickly from cave-ins, lung disease from dust inhalation, exhaustion, and brutal treatment. The owners of these mines, often the Roman state itself or wealthy private contractors, did not invest in the health, training, or long-term upkeep of this population. The calculation was purely one of maximizing short-term extraction. It was cheaper to buy a replacement slave than to provide adequate food, rest, and medical care to preserve the life of an existing one. The cost-benefit analysis favored constant high turnover. Imagine the mango selling a group of these unfortunates. There is no talk of specialized skills or loyalty. The auctioneer merely confirms their age, young and strong enough for the initial shock of the work, and their basic health able to survive the journey to the mine. The purchase price covered the few months, or perhaps a year, of brutal labour the master could extract before the slave succumbed. The price tag was a rental fee for their final year of life. This leads us to a crucial, quirky, or fringe tidbit. The mine slaves were the one category where the master had the least incentive to offer the path of the peculium, or manumission. While a highly skilled domestic slave could buy his freedom for a massive sum, a mine slave's ultimate value lay in his continued, uninterrupted, high-risk physical labour. The concept of saving up 10,000 sestertii for freedom, while earning minimal wages and facing certain death, was a fantasy. This sealed their fate both physically and economically. They were locked into their low purchase price and terminal employment. Now for a piece of light sarcasm which highlights the bleakness. A mine overseer is haggling with a mango. "Look at this group, they seem weak," the overseer complains. The mango insists, "Nonsense, Decimus, they've been specially bred for minimal complaints. And look, they come with a 3-month warranty against total exhaustion. If they expire before then, I'll give you a discount on the next batch. They're practically self-degrading assets, a Roman investor's dream." The joke turns the high mortality rate into a perverse business model. The treatment of quarry slaves was similarly brutal. These slaves, used to cut and transport the massive blocks of marble and stone needed for Rome's monumental architecture, faced crippling accidents and chronic injuries. Their life expectancy, while slightly better than that of the mine slaves due to working above ground, was still drastically lower than that of agricultural or domestic labourers. Their purchase price reflected this dangerous employment risk. Historians still argue whether the reliance on extremely cheap, disposable mine slaves stunted technological innovation in Roman mining. Did the easy, constant supply of cheap human life remove the economic incentive for Roman engineers to develop safer or more efficient extraction machinery, relying instead on brute, inexpensive muscle power? The low price of the slave may have inadvertently led to the high cost of technological stagnation. The price dynamic here is a direct contrast to the Greek tutor. The tutor was a high-value, low-risk, long-term asset demanding a high price. The mine slave was a low-value, high-risk, short-term asset demanding the lowest price. The market efficiently assigned a financial value to a human life based on its predicted duration of usefulness. The only time a mine slave might become suddenly valuable was if a rare geological knowledge was discovered, but that was an exception, not the rule. You realize, watching this grim transaction, that the low price paid for the mine slave was the true price of Roman grandeur. The dazzling marble of the Forum and the silver used to mint the coins that bought the educated Greek were all paid for by the rapid, uncompensated extinction of the human being at the very bottom of the economic hierarchy. We emerge from the dark, grim reality of the mines and return to the sun-drenched, dust-checked theatre of commerce, the Roman slave auction. This is the moment of truth, the culmination of conquest, kidnapping and breeding, where human life is finally reduced to a single, successful bid. You are now standing as a prospective buyer, and we will walk through the cold mechanics of purchasing a human chattel. The setting is the market square, often near the harbour for fresh arrivals, or a dedicated covered structure called the cellar. The atmosphere is loud, a blend of the auctioneer's booming voice, the murmurs of the crowd, and the chilling silence of the enslaved standing on a raised platform called the cataster. This visible display of human goods is a crucial mainstream historical fact that underscores the public accepted nature of the trade. The enslaved people are often stripped or sparsely clad to allow potential buyers to thoroughly inspect their physique, their muscles, teeth, and general health. Critically, new arrivals from outside Italy, war captives, or those who were deemed highly valuable, were sometimes compelled to stand with one foot whitened with chalk gypsum, a signal to the buyers that this merchandise was freshly imported, and that the seller was making certain guarantees or taking none, if the chalk was replaced by the pileus cap we discussed earlier. The auctioneer or praeco is not merely a shouter, he is a skilled salesperson, a mango in the service of the seller. His job is to extol the virtues of the person on the block, highlighting their origin if desirable, their strength, and their claimed skills. He will recite any relevant warranties provided by the seller, which is the most important legal aspect of the sale. The seller was legally bound by the ideal's edict to disclose specific flaws. You, the buyer, must listen carefully. The auctioneer is required to announce if the slave is morbus, afflicted by a chronic, known disease like epilepsy or consumption; vitium, suffering from a serious non-physical defect like known criminality or tendency to run away; fuga; peregrinus, of foreign origin often stated to imply lack of knowledge of Roman customs unless their origin was desirable. The omission of any such significant defect was grounds for a redhibition lawsuit within 6 months, forcing the seller to take the slave back and return your money, or a lawsuit for quantis minaris, which resulted in a partial refund. This legal framework, designed to protect the buyer's capital, standardized the sales process of human property. The process of inspection is deeply dehumanizing. You, the buyer, are encouraged to approach the cataster. You might prod the slave's muscles, check the tension of their skin, open their mouth to examine their teeth for age and decay, and scrutinize their eyes. If a slave claimed a particular skill, say, a scribe, you might even demand a quick test, asking him to write a few lines on a wax tablet, or recite a passage of Greek poetry. The buyer's valuation is rapid and holistic, incorporating everything we've discussed: age, health, gender, perceived loyalty, and market rarity. The bidding commences, usually starting at a low base price set by the seller. Let's watch a transaction for a standard, moderately skilled male slave, a carver. The bidding starts at 3,000 sestertii. The price creeps up in small increments of a few hundred sestertii at a time, driven by 2 or 3 competing buyers. This competitive atmosphere can quickly drive a fair price into an inflated one, fueled by impatience and desire. The final price, perhaps 5,500 sestertii, is the accepted market cost for that particular combination of utility and risk at that moment in time. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit concerning the auction documentation. Once the hammer falls, the transaction is finalized, and a written contract, the tabula or syngraph, is drawn up. This document meticulously listed the price, the seller's name, the buyer's name, and all the declared defects and warranties. For new war captives, this tabula would often include a specific clause guaranteeing the slave's health for a defined period, usually 30 days. However, for a slave sold with the pileus, the warning cap, the tabula would explicitly state a complete lack of warranty, with the chilling phrase, capiti venditus, sold with a cap, meaning the buyer accepts all risks. Here's a light joke about the auction atmosphere. The Praeco is trying to sell an older gentleman who is clearly past his prime. The bidding is stalled at 1,000 sestati. Exasperated, the auctioneer shouts, "Come on, citizens, this man is an ancient philosopher. He may not lift a bucket, but he's guaranteed to tell you, at length, why your recent financial speculations were morally suspect and doomed to fail. Think of him as a living, breathing moral hazard warning. Price reduction now to 950 sestati." The joke relies on the idea of a slave having an academic skill that is completely useless but high-priced. The successful buyer then pays the mango and receives the title to the human chattel. Immediately after the sale, a Roman citizen buyer would also pay a state tax, the vicesima libertatis, a 4% tax on the sale, which, ironically, was the same tax applied to manumission. The state profited both from the sale into bondage and the purchase out of it. Historians still argue whether the elaborate legal framework for the sale of slaves, the Adel's edict and the detailed warranties, humanized the institution by creating a highly regulated market, or whether it simply reinforced the idea of the slave as pure property, protecting the economic interests of the citizen class, while offering zero moral consideration to the human being on the cataster. The moment of ownership transfer is absolute. The slave, who might have been an emperor in his own land just weeks before, is now legally subjected to the buyer's dominion. This new master now has the legal right to command, punish, and determine the entire future of the individual. The experience of the slave auction encapsulates the totality of Roman commodification. The buyer is not engaging in a transaction of labour, but a transaction of absolute dominion, purchased for a precise monetary figure based on a cold, calculated assessment of potential utility and guaranteed lack of defect. You watch the final slave being led away, the chalk marks now on your property, marking the end of the market's ruthless ballet. We have seen the price paid for human capital in all its forms, from the household to the mine. Now, we must turn our attention to the darker side of the market, where the state attempted, however imperfectly, to impose moral and legal limits on the commodification of human life. We begin with a chilling transaction that the law sought to control: the forbidden sale of a slave directly into the arena. You must understand that the legal framework for slavery was built on the owner's absolute right to his property dominium. A master could generally use, abuse, or sell his slave as he saw fit. However, the use of a slave for the violence of the public games, either as a gladiator or as a person exposed to wild beasts damnatio ad bestias, carried specific, state-level implications, and was sometimes treated as an exception to the master's total control. This is a mainstream historical fact. Under the reigns of emperors like Claudius and later, Domitian, there were attempts to regulate the most egregious abuses against slaves, often linked to the games. The most relevant restriction concerned the master who sought to sell his slave because of an offence directly into the gladiatorial schools or the arena. Imagine a wealthy master who has grown tired of a particularly insolent or troublesome domestic slave. Previously, he might have had that slave executed, or simply sold him into the mines. But selling him to the Lanista gladiator trainer was a powerful, symbolic and final act of revenge. This act, however, was increasingly viewed by the imperial government as undermining the state's own control of a capital punishment and public spectacle. The restriction essentially stated that a master could not, simply out of cruelty or whim, condemn a slave to the arena as a form of private vengeance and turn a profit doing so. If a slave was to become a gladiator, it was meant to be a commercial decision based on the slave's physical suitability, a high-priced investment, as we learned, or a judicial decision due to a crime, damnatio ad ludum. It was not supposed to be an impulsive act of capital punishment disguised as a sale. The legal philosophy here is a subtle but important one. The state wanted to preserve the distinction between private ownership and public condemnation. Condemning a man to death in the arena was the ultimate expression of state power. If a master could do it merely by selling the man to a lanista for a high price, it blurred the lines. Therefore, specific imperial rescripts were issued, stipulating that if a master wanted to sell a slave to a lanista for reasons other than the slave's demonstrable fitness and training for a professional fighting career, he might need to justify it, or risk losing the slave without compensation. The practical effect of this prohibition was often minimal, but its intent was profound. It set a precedent that the slave's life, even as property, was not absolutely subject to the master's capricious terminal cruelty, especially when that cruelty intersected with public life. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The law sometimes allowed the slave himself to appeal to a magistrate if the master's treatment was exceptionally harsh and threatened the slave's life, especially concerning a forced, unnecessary sale into the arena. While such appeals were rare and highly dependent on the magistrate's personal views, the legal avenue existed. If the appeal was successful, the magistrate could force the master to sell the slave to a different, more humane master, essentially forcing a transfer of property to protect the slave's life, and crucially, preserving the slave's value as capital for the original owner. The law sought to prevent capital destruction, not abolish slavery. This brings us to a darkly humorous observation. Imagine a Roman nobleman trying to sell his slave Cato to a lanista out of sheer spite. The lanista is examining Cato, is too thin for a mamillo, and he whines about his rations. "I'll give you 2,000 sestertii," the nobleman screams. "But he poisoned my wine last week. He deserves to die a slow, agonizing death." The lanista shrugs. "Sir are in an arena, not a theatrical tragedy. If he's a proven wine poisoner, you should have sold him as a taster for a rival. I'm deducting another 500 sestertii for the paperwork needed to assure the magistrate this isn't private vengeance." The joke highlights the cynical market prioritization over the desire for revenge. Historians still argue whether these imperial edicts that limited a master's power over life and death, such as the prohibition on abandoning sick or elderly slaves, or selling them into the arena, were motivated by genuine moral and philosophical shifts among the elite influenced by Stoicism, or if they were purely pragmatic measures intended to prevent social disorder, preserve the slave population as a valuable national resource, and centralize the state's authority over life and death. Was it humanity or resource management? The price of a gladiator, as we discussed, was usually high, precisely because they were a high-risk asset intended for entertainment. The law attempted to ensure that the sale into that dangerous profession was a commercial decision, not a death sentence handed down by an angry paterfamilias. When the sale was clearly punitive, the price might be artificially low, reflecting the slave's poor disposition, but the master still faced the potential legal wrath of the state for overstepping his authority. In essence, the state was claiming the ultimate price of a human life, its terminal disposition, for itself, even in the context of chattel slavery. This was one of the first cracks in the absolute legal doctrine of dominium over human property. We continue our necessary descent into the restrictive aspects of the Roman slave trade, moving from the violence of the arena to the exploitation within the city streets and private homes. While the trading human beings for sexual purposes was commonplace and largely unregulated, there were limited, though often ineffective, legal attempts to forbid the most egregious exploitation, the selling of very young female slaves specifically for prostitution. The use of enslaved people, male and female, in the sex trade was a grim, widespread and entirely accepted part of the Roman economy. A vast industry often generating considerable wealth for the master who owned the brothels, lupanaria or rented out his slaves. The price for these slaves was often extremely high, driven by the combination of beauty, youth and the high profit potential they represented, entirely detached from their domestic or agricultural utility. However, the Roman legal system occasionally attempted to temper the absolute dominium of the master when it concerned the complete moral destruction of a very young, often virginal female slave puella. This limited intervention is a significant, if tragically minimal, mainstream historical fact. Under Emperor Domitian, late 1st century CE, a specific decree was issued, and later reinforced, that aimed to curb the practice of castration often performed on young male slaves to preserve their market value for specific roles, and, crucially, to forbid the forced commercial prostitution of girls under a certain age, though that age itself is often debated and inconsistently applied in the ancient sources. The intent was to protect girls from the earliest and most brutal forms of sexual exploitation within the brothel system. The law targeted the master who sold the girl with the express purpose of her becoming a prostitute, especially if the girl was of particularly tender years. If a master had, for instance, raised a beautiful child, and then, as soon as she was physically able, sold her directly to a Leno pimp brothel owner, he might face a penalty. The prohibition was less about the act of prostitution itself, which remained legal and ubiquitous, and more about the deliberate destruction of innocence for commercial gain by the original owner. The penalty for violating this prohibition often revolved around forced manumission, the master would be compelled to free the slave without receiving payment, thereby losing his valuable capital investment. This penalty was designed not as moral judgment, but as a direct financial disincentive. The master's punishment was the total loss of a highly valued asset. This created a peculiar situation where the very young female slave had a legal protection that, ironically, often inflated her price if she was sold before the master corrupted her. A buyer might pay a premium for a young girl with the intent of raising her as a domestic companion or an ancilla housemaid, precisely because her virginal status was legally protected from being commercially exploited by the original owner. She represented a clean slate, a guarantee against the immediate damage of the brothel. Now, here was a particularly chilling, quirky or fringe tidbit. The legal prohibition was often circumvented by clever mangons and masters. Instead of selling the girl directly to a known leno, which was prohibited, the master would sell her to a straw buyer, a friend or business associate who was nominally a private citizen, but was known to be in the business of supplying the brothels. The second, indirect sale removed the original master's legal liability, as he could claim ignorance of the girl's ultimate fate. The price paid for the girl in the initial regulated sale was often discounted to account for this necessary, quick and indirect transfer. Let's insert a moment of dark legal levity. A master is selling a young girl to a man who is clearly a known leno, but the sale is happening in the street, not the market. The magistrate happens to walk by. The master quickly says, "Ah, Optimus, I'm just selling this poor girl to Lucius here, who claims he needs a new servant to polish his spoons. Nothing illicit here. And, Lucius, remember, the price is only 5,000 sestertii, because she's terrible at polishing spoons." The joke highlights the blatant legal fiction required to maintain the facade of propriety in a transaction whose real purpose was clear to everyone involved. The philosophical underpinnings of this restriction are still a subject of debate among scholars. Historians still argue whether the ban on selling young girls into prostitution reflected a growing influence of Stoic philosophy on Roman law, a sense of obligation to protect the weakest members of society, or if it was primarily a patrician concern over public morality and the desire to control the most visible forms of degradation that could threaten the social order. Was it an impulse toward humaneness, or an impulse toward preserving public decorum? The price of a female slave who was publicly sold as a virgo virgin was always significantly higher than one who was not. Virginitas was a marketable asset, a form of temporary capital that allowed the seller to fetch a premium, whether the buyer intended to use her domestically, as a companion, or exploit her sexually himself. The legal restrictions attempted to interfere with the transfer of this capital to the institutional brothel, but did little to stop the private exploitation. You realize that even in the rarest of cases where the Roman state intervened to protect a slave, the intervention was purely economic in its nature. It protected the Virgo's high market price from being immediately ruined by commercial destruction, and it punished the master by seizing his property. It was an act of financial enforcement, not a moral emancipation. The price of this protection was paid not by the state, but by the master who forfeited his property. We have explored the price of a slave's acquisition and the limited prohibitions on their sale. Now, we must examine the final, most complex and often most expensive transaction, the price of their freedom. This is the intricate legal landscape of manumission, governed primarily by the Lex Alia Sentia, a crucial piece of legislation that placed constraints on both the master's power to free his property and the slave's potential path to liberty. The act of manumission, the legal release of a slave from bondage, was not a simple matter of a master's will. It was subject to state control, reinforcing the idea that the enslaved population was not just private property, but a national resource whose sudden reduction could destabilize the economy and society. The Lex Aelia Sentia, passed in 4 CE during the reign of Augustus, is a mainstream historical fact that formalized and restricted manumission, directly influencing the slave's ultimate value. The law introduced 2 major restrictions, both of which carried economic implications. Age of the master. It forbade a master under the age of 20 from manumitting slaves, unless the manumission was done via vindicta, a formal public process before a magistrate, and only for a good cause, such as marriage to a female slave. This restriction aimed to prevent young, inexperienced Romans from dissipating valuable family capital slaves through youthful generosity or debt. Age of the slave. It forbade the manumission of a slave under the age of 30, unless again it was done before a council of magistrates and justified by a good cause. This ensured that a master could not simply discard sick, elderly, or useless slaves late in life to avoid the responsibility of their care. It also ensured that the state received a proper working life from the asset before granting freedom. The economic consequence of this law was significant. It secured the master's investment for a longer period. If you purchased a slave for 10,000 sestertii at age 20, the law guaranteed you at least 10 years of their prime labour before they could be manumitted. This legal guarantee of asset retention was priced into the initial purchase. The cost of a slave was therefore higher because the master was protected from premature loss of his capital. Furthermore, the law restricted the number of slaves a master could free in his will. A master with many slaves could only free a maximum percentage, using a sliding scale, and never more than 100 slaves, regardless of the size of his holdings. It was a clear attempt to limit the rapid growth of the freedman population and to prevent the excessive depletion of the labour pool by wealthy masters seeking posthumous praise. Now let's connect this back to the price paid by the slave themselves, the peculium we discussed earlier. The lex alia sentia essentially gave the master immense leverage in negotiating the manumission price. Since both the master and the slave faced legal restrictions on when and how manumission could occur, the slave's desperation to achieve freedom, particularly before age 30, translated into a massively inflated price paid by the peculium. The master was selling not just freedom, but early freedom, which commanded a premium. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The law also created a category of freedmen known as dediticia. These were former slaves who had been guilty of a crime or a severely degrading act while enslaved, such as being publicly tortured. Even upon manumission, the lex alia sentia declared that they were not to receive the full rights of Roman citizenship, and they were forbidden from ever residing within 100 miles of Rome. This legal branding reduced their social and economic opportunities, meaning that their freedom, while absolute, was severely limited. This bad reputation was a perpetual price paid for past behaviour, and was intended as a permanent warning. Let's insert a joke about the strict requirements. A slave, nearing his 30th birthday, approaches his master. "Master, I have the 40,000 sestertii in my peculium to buy my freedom. I am exactly 29 years and 11 months old. I've waited all my life." The master shakes his head gravely. "My dear Servius, the law is the law. Come back in 30 days. And while you wait, you can use those extra 4 weeks of involuntary labour to repaint my dining hall. You see, the cost of being impatient is exactly one freshly painted triclinium." The humour lies in the master's legalistic exploitation of the slave's eager proximity to freedom. Historians still argue whether the lex alia sentia was primarily a tool of social control, attempting to preserve the purity of the citizen body by limiting the influx of freedmen, or if it was a purely economic policy designed to protect labour, supply, and ensure that masters realised the full economic return on their human capital investment. The law was a clear signal from the Roman state that the price of freedom was not only high, but it was also subject to the state's overriding interest in maintaining social and economic stability. The Roman citizens' right to own slaves was a private matter. The consequences of freeing them was a public concern. Every time a slave purchased his freedom, the price he paid was magnified by the weight of these imperial regulations. We have meticulously calculated the financial cost of a Roman slave, the shifting sestertii for the field hand, the inflated auri for the tutor, and the capital forfeited for freedom. But now, we must look beyond the ledgers and currency to the vast invisible cost of the institution, the psychological and societal price that slavery exacted from everyone in Rome, master and slave alike. The cost of a slave was not merely economic. It was the foundation of a pervasive social contract that defined power, morality, and identity. This social contract began with the absolute legal fiction that the slave was merely a tool with a voice instrumentam vocale. This foundational premise, a mainstream historical fact of Roman jurisprudence, meant the master's power was nearly total. However, the contradiction was that this tool was capable of love, loyalty, betrayal, and intellect, qualities that inevitably forced the Romans to wrestle with the morality and practicality of their system. The cost to the master was the erosion of basic human empathy. To live constantly surrounded by people whose lives you controlled entirely, from their diet and clothing to their partnerships and death, required a constant, conscious act of dehumanization. This internal psychological cost manifested in two primary ways: fear and distrust. Every Roman master lived with the latent, ever-present fear of revolt or private vengeance. The most famous example is the massive Spartacus rebellion. But the daily fear was more subtle: the poisoned dinner, the carelessly sharpened knife, the whispered gossip. This cost manifested as the need for constant vigilance and punitive measures, such as the use of the ergastulum, a private prison for slaves or for large households, the reliance on a professional villicus manager who could absorb the moral burden of cruelty. The price of owning a human being was the payment of perpetual paranoia. Moral degradation. Many Roman philosophers, particularly the Stoics like Seneca, worried that slavery damaged the master more than the slave. Seneca argued that the practice fostered arrogance, luxury, and moral laziness in the Roman elite, making them reliant on the labour of others and incapable of self-discipline. The high price paid for a domestic slave wasn't just a convenience. It was a subsidy for the master's moral decline, a luxury that cost him his own virtue. For the slave, the cost was the total loss of agency and self-ownership. Even with the possibility of the peculium and manumission, their existence was a life lived on borrowed time and dictated terms. This perpetual state of dependency fostered a complex mix of responses: accommodation and loyalty. Many slaves, particularly vannae, homeborn or high-status domestic staff, accommodated themselves to their fate, finding security and comfort in the structure of the domus. Their loyalty was often genuine, earned through years of relatively benign treatment, or the hope of eventual freedom. Dissimulation and resilience. More commonly, the slave's survival relied on the art of dissimulation, pretending to be more content, less clever, or more obedient than they truly were. This psychological cost of constantly suppressing one's true self was the daily, invisible price of survival. The subtle, corrosive relationship is highlighted by a crucial, quirky or fringe tidbit. The Roman practice of marrying a slave to a free citizen sometimes occurred, though it was legally complex and rare. If a free person married a slave, their children were born into the slave status of the parent. This brutal reality often meant that the free partner was sacrificing their own and their children's legal status for the sake of the relationship. The high price of the slave was not just the purchase cost, but the legal price paid by the free citizen's social standing. Let's inject a piece of sociological humour into the anxiety of Roman life. What do? A master is pacing nervously while his most expensive slave, his cubicularius, is attending to him. "Tell me, Sextus," the master asks, "do you think I'm a just and honourable muster?" The slave immediately replies, "Of course, master. You are the very definition of stoic virtue," the master sighs. "I knew it. That means you hate me and are planning to poison my lentils. An honest slave would have said I'm a tyrant. Now I'll have to buy another more expensive slave just to watch you." The joke underlines the master's inability to trust any expression of loyalty, seeing everything as an act of calculated survival. The philosophical reaction to slavery was also a significant societal cost. Historians still argue whether the rise of various philosophical schools, particularly those that emphasized inner freedom and resilience, was a direct psychological coping mechanism developed by the enslaved and the free poor, or if the Stoic critique of luxury and excess was a genuine attempt by the elite to grapple with the moral implications of their own wealth built on involuntary servitude. Was Stoicism a philosophy of moral reckoning, or merely a balm for a guilty conscience? The presence of slavery also dictated the very nature of Roman leisure. Because the enslaved performed all necessary labour, free Romans enjoyed an immense amount of otium leisure, which they were theoretically supposed to spend on public service, politics, and self-improvement. When they failed to use their otium productively, they often turned to spectacles, luxury, and vice, a side effect that many Roman moralists considered a severe societal cost of their economic system. The price of their freedom was the cheapness of their time. Finally, the social contract of slavery ensured that the price of a slave dictated the slave's social reality. The high-priced, educated slave enjoyed status, comfort, and sometimes even a degree of respect. The cheap, disposable mine slave suffered brutal conditions and anonymity. The monetary value assigned at auction became a lifelong determinant of their quality of life, demonstrating that their economic price was intrinsically tied to their social standing within the vast, rigid hierarchy of the Roman world. The final, unspoken price was the permanent division of humanity into two castes, the valuable and the expendable. We have completed the chilling inventory of the Roman slave market, charting the prices of bodies and skills across centuries of imperial ambition. But all economic systems eventually shift, and even one as fundamental as Roman chattel slavery could not last forever. Our final journey traces the gradual complex shift away from this specific form of human commodification and examines the enduring dark legacy of the prices that were paid. You stand now not at the height of the empire, but in the troubled, fragmented world of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. The price of a slave is no longer a simple calculation based on a successful conquest. It is a dizzying equation affected by economic collapse, frontier instability, and demographic decline. The mainstream historical fact is that chattel slavery, the system where the enslaved person was treated purely as disposable property, did not end with a single dramatic decree. It gradually faded due to a combination of factors, often driven by the very economic principles that first fueled it. Reduced supply. The primary engine of the slave trade was military conquest. As the Roman Empire stopped expanding and focused solely on defending its shrinking borders, the massive, cheap influx of war captives dried up. No new Gauls, Dacians, or Britons meant that the low-end supply of labour was drastically curtailed. This scarcity caused the price of basic, unskilled labour to rise significantly, making it less economically feasible to maintain vast armies of disposable slaves. Economic crisis and inflation. The severe currency debasement and hyperinflation we discussed earlier made the initial purchase of a large slave familiar a risky proposition. When cash was unstable, land was the only reliable form of wealth. This instability discouraged masters from making large one-time cash investments in slaves. Rise of the colonist system. As the economy fragmented, particularly in the vast agricultural estates latifundia, masters increasingly moved away from the complex high-cost system of chattel slavery toward the system of colony tenant farmers. A colonist was technically a free person, but was legally bound to the land he farmed, owing the landlord rent and labour. This system shifted the cost of labour. The landlord no longer had to pay the purchase price, feed, house, or provide medical care for the worker. The colons bore that cost himself. The landlord secured his labour supply without the massive upfront capital investment of purchasing a slave. The price of a slave's labour, therefore, was gradually replaced by the price of a colonist's rent and fixed labour obligation. The colonist was not free in the modern sense. He couldn't leave the land, but his status as a person rather than property was a fundamental economic shift away from the absolute control defined by the auction block. This transition was slow and uneven. Slavery certainly did not vanish. It continued in domestic and specialized roles. But the economic mass production of slavery, which powered the farms and mines, was broken. The philosophical cost we discussed earlier began to manifest in public law too. While never leading to abolition, the later empire, under the influence of Christianity and evolving moral sensibilities often seen as a convenient way to enforce discipline, saw the introduction of more laws designed to protect slaves from the most egregious abuses, such as the sale of a wife, husband, child away from their concubinarian slave partnership, or the gratuitous torture of slaves. These laws did not abolish the system, but they effectively added a small legal cost of compliance to the master's ownership. Here is a crucial, quirky or fringe tidbit concerning the final valuation. In the waning days of the empire, the few remaining high-value skilled slaves, the architects, the engineers, the gold workers, were often valued in ounces of gold in wills and transactions, entirely bypassing the worthless imperial silver coinage. Their extreme rarity and irreplaceable skill meant their price remained stable and high, acting as a final desperate form of liquid capital in a collapsing economy. When all those failed, a master knew he could still exchange a brilliant slave for hard gold. Let's offer a final, weary joke. An aged Roman paterfamilias in the 5th century CE complains to his son, "I swear, Aulus, things are better when a man could buy a dozen Goths for the price of 1 gold solidus." Now, they're not even slaves, they're colony, and they complain about the rent. And they still expect me to find a doctor for their sick goat. It cost me more to manage their freedom than it ever did to own them. The humour lies in the irony of the master viewing the colonist system as a more expensive, less efficient headache, and the brutal simplicity of chattel slavery. The economic legacy of the slave trade is that it forever imprinted a classist division into Western society. The association of physical, manual or menial labour with low status, the work of the enslaved, persisted long after chattel slavery itself largely disappeared in Western Europe. The freedom granted by the price paid in the peculium or by the manumission process did not grant true equality. The freedman libertus was always marked by his past price, remaining a client of his former master, facing social stigma, and rarely achieving the highest echelons of Roman society. Historians still argue whether the economic pressure, The scarcity of supply and the cost of maintenance was the primary driver in the decline of chattel slavery, or for slow moral transformation, fueled by Stoicism and eventually Christianity, played the decisive role in replacing chattel with serfdom in the West. The final, lasting price paid by Rome was the normalization of absolute human disposability. Even as the legal system evolved and the form of servitude changed to colonate, the memory of the auction block, the chalked foot, and the chilling price tags remained, a permanent stain on the foundation of European labour relations and social hierarchy. The prices paid for slaves were recorded in the ledgers, but the true cost was recorded on the soul of an empire.